Computer. All right. All right. I know it doesn't look like there's a lot of people that are coming on, but we had close to 200 registered, so this is good. And we're going to get started. I am honored and privileged to have Dr. Hurford and his son Thomas Hurford with us tonight. I had the privilege of meeting David last July in Kansas when Credentials Unlimited was there talking to their state about micro-credentials. And David impressed me then, and he impressed me at the IDA conference last month or 2 months ago in October. And so we decided that this was too good of a opportunity to not have people understand what the heck is going on with all the changes in our federal government and how that affects you as an educator and or parent. So, David, Thomas, take it away.
Thank you. First thing I thought I'd do is share our presentation and so people can see it. All righty.
There we go.
Okay, so firstly, I wanted to say to everyone, thanks for being here tonight. This is obviously a time for nearly everyone. It's very, very busy. Certainly for parents, busy for getting ready for the holidays, especially moms. But I know dads do some stuff too. So I'm going to say, okay, dads do some stuff too. But we know it's really on the back of most moms out there, as is seemingly almost everything. And for teachers, this is, very busy time wrapping things up and all those kinds of things. So, thanks for being here. A little bit about myself. This is about my 40th year of working in the area of dyslexia, reading difficulties, and ADHD. And every day I'm excited to do it. I'll be sad when I don't do it any longer, but still in the game. And I appreciate that people are interested in what we have to say. Thomas is a school psychologist who is now working at the Center for Reading here as our Director of Intervention and Professional Development. I'm going to tell you a little story about him. When he was a senior in high school, I said, Thomas, what do you want to do for a career? And he said, well, I want to do what you're doing. And Thomas and I have, we're both a couple of smart Alecks. And so I'm thinking, okay, he's just yanking my chain because I was the chair of the Department of Psychology and Counseling. And for me, administration, of those of you who are administrators, I'm not talking about you, but for me, administration is like, no, that is not something you want to aspire to. You do it because you're called to do it, because there's a need for you to do it. You're the best person to be involved with that, whatever the case may be. But that's not something you want to aspire to be. And he says, no, I don't want to be a department chair. I want to help kids learn to be competent readers. And I was like, oh, okay. So as an undergraduate, he worked with us collecting data, doing things, became an interventionist, quickly one of our best interventionists because he really could relate to kids very well. His 2 years as a graduate student, he also worked at the Center for Reading and then became a school psych and more was involved with more sticky IEP meetings and doing things that are very challenging and didn't get to work directly with kids that he liked. So the opening happened here at the Center for Reading, and so he is now here, which is good for us because he does an amazing job with regard to helping kids become competent readers. I got into this area because I'm a research scientist first, and I was going to study gerontology. My doctorate's in developmental psychology.
Looks
But
like it's been down to
took
wins for everyone involved.
I took a course on the psychology of learning disabilities, and everything that I liked about science and studying humans and psychology was in that. It's like, that's what I've been doing ever since. And it's been really great. Some of you may notice my name as the co-executive editor of Perspectives of Language and Literacy, which is an IDA journal, and very proud of our work that we do on perspectives. And we've moved from talking more about the science to showing teachers how to implement structured literacy, which I think at this point in time we need to do. But the focus of obviously what we're talking about tonight are what are the changes happening at the United States Department of Education, and what does that mean for students with disabilities, including dyslexia? And another footnote is I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. And during that period of time, Star Trek generation, happened. And for many in my generation, and particularly myself, I feel that when we're making a contribution to society, that's the name of the game. What we look like doesn't matter, just like in Star Trek. As long as they're working together for a common good, it didn't matter if we were green, three heads, or whatever the case may be. And that's essentially what our focus is helping all kids become competent readers. And so part of the emphasis for that was the Department of Education. And the Department of Education, as we'll talk about this evening, how it got started, why it got started, what's going on with it, what's happening now. And that's, the focus of what we're doing. And but before we get to like what is happening now, it actually has a fairly long history. So how did we get here? And how did we get to the point where we're talking about, essentially eliminating the Department of Education? So firstly, when we talk about education, Thomas Jefferson said, no, I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. In other words, education is supremely important. And the forefathers really never envisioned people voting who didn't know what they were voting about. They're just voting for their team, not for the concepts that were important. And today, it seems, today that a lot more people are interested in voting for, quote, their team than they are in terms of knowing what the issues are for which they're voting. And of course, Nelson Mandela said education the most powerful weapon. I don't like the term weapon. I would have said tool, but then nobody knows who I am and everyone knows who Nelson Mandela is. But education is the most powerful tool which you can use to change the world. And I think all of us believe that, or we wouldn't be here talking about these things tonight. So there's this long history of federal versus state power. And actually, if you have read much about what happened with the framing of the Constitution, you know that some of those individuals who signed their name, there was lots of argument about that balance of power between federal and state government. So when you hear this argument about federal versus state governmental power, this is not a new thing. It's in our DNA from the very, very beginning. And so the Constitution was essentially a compromise. And of course, the Bill of Rights for sure were a compromise, because some of those who said, yeah, I'd be willing to sign the Constitution and help get it ratified, but others said, I want to know what the exact powers are you're talking about. And so that was the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, that enumerated those powers and rights. And then the 10th Amendment is the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Meaning that the framers really also believed in state power. And of course, then you have the Federalist Papers and other things. We won't get into that, but you just need to know that that notion of federal versus state power is still a very important aspect of what is going on, even today. But a brief history of education, the Department of Education. Many of you know Horace Mann. He advocated for free, universal, non-sectarian and public education. He thought that every child should receive a basic education funded by local taxes. Now, you may also know that Horace Mann is considered supreme in terms of education and getting education to the masses. Every single person had the ability, according to Horace Mann, to be educated. And notice he said free, universal, non-sectarian public education, which sounds an awful lot like free, appropriate public education, doesn't it? So FAPE, which is a term we use a lot in special education, is something that really Horace Mann got many people thinking about. And he said the education is the absolute right of every human being that comes into the world. Now, having said all those great things about Horace Mann, which there's many more things to say about him that are great than not, but he was 100% wrong about how to teach reading. So remember that if you disagree with someone, there's probably something else that you would agree with. It's important for us to kind of come together and, to work together to make things a better place. But in the 1830s, we got this common school movement. And again, it's Horace Mann saying everyone should be educated and all children have the right. And education is essential to a democracy, which is certainly the case today. It promotes equity, which he was very strongly interested in, and he wanted to be inclusive. He also suggested that the curriculum should emphasize reading and math and moral and civic education, but that moral education should be sectarian, not a function of a particular religion. And he also promoted teaching as a career for both women and men, which at the time was not essentially the case. And of course, during this time period from 1820 to 1860, the population increase was about 21.8 million people. And the immigrant population is a little less than actually 5.5 million, but quite a large increase in the population was due to immigration. And people at the time thought that public education was a great vehicle to assimilate all these different nationalities and cultures of the immigrants into a cohesive whole so we could think of ourselves as the United States of American citizens versus, well, I am a German and I live in the United States, or I'm French and I live in the United States, or I'm Italian and live in the United States. And so this shared sense of national identity was important, and it promoted this social cohesiveness. Common schools, they expanded very swiftly in the North and the Midwest, where industry was more established in larger cities, and it provided funding for the expansion through taxes. So if you have more industry in more cities, you have more tax base. The tax base goes to pay for education. The challenges for the South, more rural population, made funding schools challenging. They were very wary of using federal funds. You have to remember this is antebellum South, where it was essentially a white patriarchal supremacy society and really didn't want people to be educated necessarily. Most of the people who were educated in the South were homeschooled or tutored, and the yeoman class felt that common schools were essentially a handout, and they didn't want any part of that. And of course, Black people were prohibited from education in the South. So there's certainly some pretty large challenges in the common school movement with regard to Southern states, which brings us to the Civil War. And you might say, really, we're talking about the Civil War? Yes, it's actually important in terms of what is happening today. Not just the Civil War and then Reconstruction, but actually the failure of Reconstruction, which is, a lot of times when we talk about Civil War history in schools, we talk about the important battles and this and that, but not really the political or philosophical reasons for what happened, which are actually way more important and way more interesting and have a relevancy today still. So the purpose of Reconstruction after the Civil War was to reunite the nation. Abraham Lincoln was very strongly interested in reuniting the nation. His view was that the states that seceded from the Union were still part of the Union. So he's very, to some extent, lenient on the South with regard to Reconstruction. But he also, the purpose of Reconstruction, particularly for the radical Republicans at the time, and the radical Republicans, actually things have shifted completely. The radical Republicans were those individuals who believed in civil rights, were abolitionists or anti-slavery. And, it's just a little bit different today. But when we talk about the radical Republicans, they're very, very progressive. So they want to reunite the nation, create a more equitable society. And of course, as a function of Reconstruction, although these were very, very, very challenging times, we have the 13th Amendment, the abolishment of slavery in 1865, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The 14th Amendment was essentially assures that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, apply to all states. There can be no state in the Union that says, no, 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 we're not going to do that. Even the states that didn't ratify the 14th Amendment, it was ratified and became the law of the land, so they had no choice but to participate. And then the 15th Amendment, voting rights for all males, regardless of color. Women did not have the opportunity to vote at that point in time, which of course is a huge oversight and definitely a mistake. But there's some reasons why Reconstruction was interrupted. Firstly, President Lincoln was quite genius in terms of politics, and he selected Andrew Johnson as his running mate to show that he was serious about getting the United States back as a union. And Johnson was from Tennessee, one of the first states to secede, but Johnson stayed in the Senate as a senator during the Civil War and didn't abandon the Congress. So to some extent, Lincoln thought, well, this is a perfect person to show that we're interested in the Union. Of course, Andrew Johnson basically was raised very poor, illiterate parents. He worked as a tailor. He was a very bright individual. His young wife taught him how to read better and to do better. And he hated the white aristocracy, hated them with a passion, had no liking whatsoever for them. And in his notion of Reconstruction, after Lincoln was assassinated, his notion was to allow the states to come back online, but the white aristocracy would have to come to him and beg to come back. But he was also very lenient in other in regards, and he and Congress fought back and forth. He is the first president to be impeached. He was tried in the Senate, which impeach means there's enough evidence to say something went on, just like an indictment for us. And during his trial, he needed for him to be thrown out of office, he needed 30, well, not he, Congress needed 36 votes, and the votes was 35-19. So he narrowly escaped losing the presidency. And by the way, if he would have been president, he didn't have a vice president because he was the vice president. And so the Senate pro tem would have been the president, and he was a radical Republican who would have fought very hard then for Reconstruction to be more challenging than it was. So we don't really recognize the first one of the Great Depressions in 1873. The Civil War cost an enormous amount of money, particularly for the South. And the Northerners during this economic depression were like, you know what? I don't know that we need to be spending a lot of money in the South rebuilding it. Just like when Germany was reunited, East and West Germany, if you're old enough to remember that, the West Germans weren't really all that thrilled about paying for the East Germans to get up to speed with regard to a unified Germany. So the same thing kind of happened here. And so the focus shifted away from Reconstruction. People were unwilling to contribute to support for Reconstruction on the northern side. And then white supremacist terrorism, the KKK, other organization, black laws, black codes, Jim Crow law, and other things that eventually came about, essentially was really a failure of Reconstruction to get people to have equal rights. And so even today, there is that challenge. And so that's why we're talking about these issues, because they still play a role today. And in reality, after the Mexican War, we gained an enormous amount of geography. Almost half of Mexico became the United States: Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Kansas and Oklahoma, the western part. And the Southern aristocracy wanted to take their slaves into the West and become even more rich. And the Northerners went, you can't do that because we want to have people who aren't slaves to be able to make a living. And, if you have slaves there, there's no need for that labor. So, I mean, this is complicated stuff, very complicated. But Reconstruction, like I said, was essentially for the most part a failure. It was interrupted. The 1876 presidential election played a role in this. What happened essentially is that Rutherford B. Hayes became the president, even though there's some doubt that he actually got the votes. But as a compromise, he said, we'll take all federal troops outside and remove them from Louisiana and South Carolina. A Southern Democrat would be appointed to Hayes' cabinet. Again, a Southern Democrat is the white patriarchal supremacist group. We're not, like Democrats today. They're different in terms of, and we won't talk about how that transpired, but it slowly did transpire. But anyway, funding was provided for Southern infrastructure. And so very soon after, since there wasn't a harsh Reconstruction, the South went back to business, essentially. They didn't have slaves, but they certainly did all they could to make sure that Black people were not able to vote and to have indentured servitude and other kinds of things. So it was sort of their plan to get back on track. So that's that part of the history that's not really great, that still is playing a role today. James Garfield, who became the 20th president, believed strongly in education. He is one of those that education lifted from poverty, just like Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. And he introduced a bill to create the Department of Education in 1866. And there were only two purposes for the Department of Ed at the time. And that is, they really hoped to build U.S. higher education into world-class institutions and really to drive home equity and civil rights, which is part of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was still kind of in process here. But Garfield was one of those that wanted those things to happen. Andrew Johnson, 1867, signed the bill creating the Department of Ed. That was prior to his impeachment in 1867, but he remained as the president until the next election, and he didn't have a chance to be reelected, and of course wasn't. But the major duties were to collect and disseminate information and statistics about what's going on with schools, what they look like, what is needed. And those things were occurring up until recently in the Department of Education today, where they're doing work to see what kinds of careers are out there and what type of educations do kids need to be able to do those careers. And they wanted to help improve schools and promote and share effective educational practices. Those were the main goals of the Department of Education. Didn't last long. He was demoted to an office the next year, which meant it was not a cabinet. A cabinet member was not on the president's cabinet. And the worry, of course, at the time was that the federal government would meddle in education. And people, again, the states versus federal rights. If you had a federal Department of Education, will they meddle in states' business? And the states like, we don't want that to happen. So anyway, it was demoted to an office only after 1 year of being a department and stayed that way from 1868 to 1979. It was in the Office of Education was housed either in the Department of the Interior or the former U.S. Department of Health and Welfare. Jimmy Carter came along and signed into law the Department of Education Organization Act, and the purpose was to consolidate education-related functions, so to strengthen the federal commitment to equal educational opportunities, to improve the quality of education, and to increase accountability. Because what happened just a mere 4 years prior to 1979? PL 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And if Congress is giving states money to fund special education, then Jimmy Carter and others thought that there should be federal oversight to ensure that states were making sure that they were spending money in an appropriate manner for special education. So that increased accountability is important, and it's not a coincidence that it occurred within a mere 4 years of PL 94-142, which, in my opinion, besides civil rights, women's rights, lots of other issues that are out there, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the name today, is probably one of the most important pieces of legislation that showed that people actually, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or independent, you can work towards a common goal of helping individuals become competent learners in their schools. Today, sometimes you wonder what's going on in Congress and shake your head and like, it's just a zoo up there. Of course, we only see sound bites and don't get to see everything that's going on. But the Education for All Handicapped Children Act really provided an enormous amount of support for people who had disabilities. And so the Office of Special Education Programs is the one that was providing the oversight and making sure that the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was administered appropriately. Now, I want to point out, because I think a lot of times, people say, well, we hate the Department of Education because they are meddling in our schools. If you've read the Department of Education Act, you'll find out that the Department of Ed is prohibited from exerting control on educational matters which are explicitly determined by local control. In fact, in the law, you can see it in the code, it says no provision of any applicable program shall be construed to authorize any department, agency, officer, or employee of the United States to exercise any direct supervision or control over the curriculum, program of instruction, administration, or personnel of any educational institution, school, or school system, or over the selection of libraries, blah, 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 blah. That essentially means if you don't like what's going on in your particular school, it's not the Department of Education that's doing that, it's your local school board. So if you like what's happening, thank your school board. If you don't like what's happening, go talk to your school board. It's not the Department of Education doing that. They are explicitly prohibited from doing so. So Betsy DeVos, who was our head education leader a few years ago, she says, ESSA was enacted partially in response to the widespread calls from state school chiefs to give the flexibility and opportunity to address states' unique challenges. And she said, well, this law gives you that chance. The trouble is she didn't see much going on that actually did anything about it. And then Peter Cunningham, who is an educational critic, says the promise of local control fails to deliver. Instead, local control offers a legacy of racial segregation, funding inequity, and academic mediocrity. And to some extent, he's basing that comment on data. So there have been efforts to eliminate the Department of Ed again. Reagan did so 1 year after the Department of Ed was signed into law. Ronald Reagan when he ran for president, saying one of his piece of his platform was to get rid of the Department of Education. And it wasn't eliminated, particularly due to political pressure, particularly the National Association of Educators. And even Reagan's first Department of Ed, Secretary Terrell Bell, he said, we talk about giving more responsibility to the states, and I think we should, but we shouldn't do it because of their record in education. It's been terrible. So in other words, yes, we're not going to meddle, but there needs to be a Department of Education to make sure that these things are happening appropriately. And this leads us to Chesterton's fence, which I really like the concept. Is his argument is do not remove a fence until you know why it was put up in the first place. And so, you just don't want to say, I want to get rid of the Department of Ed. Why do we have a Department of Ed in the first place? Why is it here? What's it doing? What is it supposed to do? Is it doing it appropriately or not doing it? What's the case? And obviously the control of education occurs at the local level. The Department of Ed goals relevant to special education related services, that is Section 504, to improve quality and increase accountability, equal access, and defend civil rights. Some oversight is necessary. And again, this is Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, whose goal was to dismantle the Department of Education. He's like, uh-oh, well, now I've gotten in here and I can see there's some value of it. So Thomas is going to talk briefly about special education law and a slight history of that, and then we'll get back into what is going on today.
And like David said, my section's pretty quick. It's just kind of going over the background of special education. So in 1965, there's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provides funding for public schools. And then also Title I, which is part of President Johnson's War on Poverty, which really gives funding to schools with students that have at-risk factors like low income, things like that. Next slide. David, you have to change slides. And then the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination of people with disabilities from any entity that receives federal funding and provides reasonable framework for accommodations for those individuals so they can fully participate in society and have equal access to education, healthcare, employment, and transportation. And then Education for All Handicapped Children Act, signed into law by President Ford in November of 1975, really owes a lot of what it got from the civil rights movement and resulting legislation from that. So really piggybacked on the back of that. And at that time, there were roughly around 8 million children with disabilities. Around half of them were not receiving appropriate education, and then around 2 million were not receiving access to education at all. And then some of the key features were FAPE, free and appropriate public education, parent involvement, the IEPs, which is the individualized education programs or plans, depending on what state you're in, appropriate evaluations, least restrictive environment, which is LRE, and procedural guidelines. And Child Find was part of it, but really there wasn't any guidelines put on that yet. EHA amendments of, 1997 or 1986 really adds in that Part C, which is that birth to 3. And then the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1990 removed the term handicapped and used disabilities, or like Kansas used exceptionalities, and then added traumatic brain injury and autism to the disability categories. Some more amendments in 1997 increased parent involvement, inclusion, discipline, quality of instruction, and promoting mediation. In 2004, wanted children to have sufficiently challenging educational expectations, so IEP goals being really important. Dyslexia was added, so it was no longer just SLD reading, and prohibited mandatory mediation.
Okay, so I still think there's some good news, along with there being some bad news. The good news is IDEA is still the law of the land, and states must abide by IDEA. So that part is still good. We're still okay there. But the problem is, and this is the bad news, federal spending cuts and redirection of services has weakened the implementation and effectiveness of special education. We're going to talk specifically about those things. But first, we're going to talk about what's going on in the Department of Education, because I think a lot of times, again, people don't really know what's happening. And as a function is saying blanket statements that are just unquestionably not true. But the U.S. Department of Education manages a very large range of programs that support students from early childhood all the way through post-secondary education. You can see those offices there, Institute of Educational Sciences, which is one that's essentially gone, or at least weakened such that it's essentially gone. And for those of you who are interested in dyslexia and you keep track of the progress in terms of reading, and you look at the number of kids who are reading below the basic level in reading on the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Reading, or at the basic level on the NAEP reading, or et cetera, that particular test, which was essentially started in 1969 and modified in 1992, and roughly the same kind of version has been offered since 1994, which I say that because if you track reading progress since 1994 till today, it really hasn't gotten better, which is super sad given we have an amazing amount of research that tells us how to help kids become competent readers, and we're made no progress really whatsoever. And even if you look at what's going on in Mississippi, where they've made an enormous progress in terms of the number of kids who went from below basic to in the basic range, that was amazing, right? But they still got a lot of work to do, just like the rest of us still have a lot of work to do. They're not like at 0% kids who are reading below the basic level. They're down to what the rest of the states are doing, which at 40% is terrible with a capital T. Let's make no bones about that. That's absolutely terrible. But within the Institute of Educational Sciences that actually does the research to determine what are best practices, how to disseminate that information, what's going on with lots of different things, including reading, is the Center for Education Statistics that actually runs the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Reading. And I've heard that, yes, we're going to continue to do that in 2026, which is the next time that it should be happening for 4th and 8th graders. But if we look at the performance of the Department of Education since it's been beginning of its dismantling, it doesn't look like it's going to be very good. So there's problems with that. So when people say we should get rid of the Department of Ed, but we still need to look at this data, where's it coming from? That data is not going to be provided because they're not going to be collecting that data because the organization that is doing that is kaput. So obviously a problem there. Elementary and Secondary Education Department Office, Special Education Rehabilitative Services, English Language Acquisition. You can read them. There's obviously a number of them. Federal Student Aid. There's been issues with that. And the notion is to move it to the Treasury or someone else rather than Department of Ed. But you got to realize those departments don't know how to do that. And people say, well, we can get up to speed. Yeah, let's see how that works. I mean, we talk about government inefficiency. The inefficiency of moving programs to places they don't belong is where it's inefficient. Is there inefficiency in the government? Sure, probably. But actually, according to those who actually were the programmers looking at this in DOGE, they're saying actually the government is more efficient than many businesses they've been associated with. So, I think this notion that, for me, it's like when people say we have mass fraud, we have mass waste. I'm like, show me the data where it is so we can fix it. If you can't show me that, then shut up, because it's not true then. And I've experienced that obviously on campus where I've heard, we have a problem with this on campus. And I'd say to the provost at the time, show me the data. What departments are you talking about? Because clearly that's not a difficulty in my department. So, spreading mass accusations doesn't help anyone get more efficient. So that in my opinion is, major difficulty. But the programs that are directly linked to supporting education laws, the Office of Special Education Programs, and they authorize Part B, C, and D of IDEA. The Office of Special Education Programs authorize the National Center for Special Education Research, and NCSER sponsors special education research to support IDEA by expanding knowledge, improving outcomes, evaluating findings, and disseminating findings. Granted, there have been issues with disseminating findings with regard to reading, but part of that has been pushback from those who should be the recipients of that information. It's not just, the Department of Ed has been terrible at giving that information out. We probably could have done a better job in that regard, but part of it has been the resistance of people to use that data to improve programs to make things better for kids. The Institute of Education Sciences, which is huge, and we just talked about that to some extent with the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES, provides scientific evidence for educational practices and policy, and as well as changing those practices and policies when we find scientific evidence that necessitates that happens. The Office of Civil Rights, or OCR for short, the mission is to ensure equal rights to education and to promote educational excellence through vigorous enforcement of civil rights in our nation's schools. Right now, the Office of Civil Rights has been cut more than in half. And the focus today, rather than supporting your students who are in special education, the focus with this administration currently is to do two things. Number one, to take DEI out of everything with regard to education and in the government, which is obviously misinformed given that we are a nation of diversity. So I don't know that people really understand DEI. You know, what is DEI? We are diverse. And again, see what we're talking about is the creeping up of the failure of Reconstruction to make sure that every person got equal rights. You know, so there's still these concepts that are bubbling up. And, you know, historians have talked about the long Southern notion of coming back from antebellum South. I mean, so, you know, when you look at these things, you wonder, why are these things happening? This doesn't make any sense. By 2050, the largest number of individuals who will be immigrating, or the largest increase in population will be immigrants. So, you know, there's lots of misalignment with the data that are out there. But unfortunately, the Office of Civil Rights, if you contacted them today and said, hey, I've got an issue with this state, things aren't happening the way they should with regard to special education, you're probably going to have to leave a message or send an email and no one's going to get back to you because they don't care about that anymore. They're going to make sure that we get DEI out of everything. And the other aspect is to make sure that transgender individuals don't participate in sports, which is kind of crazy because if you look at the percentage of people who are transgender, very, very small. And then you look at the number of high school students who are transgender who want to participate in the opposite of, quote, their birth sex is even smaller. So, I mean, it's sort of one of those solutions that's looking for a problem. And it's certainly not good in terms of us being inclusive and having everyone have a voice in the United States and having access. It's not happening, and it's going in, I think, many people's opinion, in the wrong direction. So we do have to talk about 2025, Project 2025. And you might say, uh-oh, we're going off the deep end. You know, I don't know that we should be talking about Project 2025. We're just going to talk about it in terms of education, because you want to see what's going on today. Currently, if you look in, you know, Project 2025, you'll see it. I mean, it's their playbook. And they said, we don't know anything about Project 2025, and we're not going to use it as a playbook, but then you look who's in government right now. A lot of the individuals who are actually people who wrote Project 2025 are there, and they're instituting what they hope to do with writing Project 2025. So reduce enforcement of civil rights. You can see that on page 330. You can go to Project 25, go to 330, and you can see reduce enforcement of civil rights. Okay. Well, I mean, if you're a person that doesn't think that's a good idea, well, here we go. Narrow the definition of discrimination, censor efforts to achieve diversity, equity, inclusion, and that's happening across the board. Even in the military, the great, you know, warriors and leaders are, you know, if they're not white male, they're being taken out of history. Again, that's crazy. It's craziness. It's not who we are as a nation. Secondly, to abolish the Department of Education, it's on page 319. 3, cut funding to public schools, particularly Title I, which is the funding that goes to low income and students at risk. School vouchers and educational savings accounts, divert the funding from public education to privates, page 346. So again, When people say that, people aren't doing that, there's a reason for it. No, there is not really a reason for it. It's this particular very small and narrow thinking with regard to what the rest of us care about, and it's being enforced. Educational outcomes are no different. Strangely enough, and I think this is worth noting, is educational outcomes when we look at school vouchers between public and private schools, there are no differences. Of the most underfunded school districts in the United States, 80% are states with vouchers. So they are diverting funds from public education and taking it from people who have no other recourse than to use public education to educate their children. 3, will lead to segregation and fewer opportunities for low-income children. Absolutely no doubt about that. 5, eliminate Head Starts on page 482. And Project Head Start has been a very successful program from its inception to help kids who are low-income kids. And if you know much about Head Start, we started doing research to look at the effectiveness of Head Start, which is to get preschool kids and their parents involved with education. We saw huge IQ gains that then dissipated back to the original IQ score or IQ gains prior to Head Start. So we're like, okay, it doesn't work. Head Start doesn't work. We should get rid of it because they aren't able to maintain that IQ gain that they get without that support in school. But see, they didn't look long enough. When you started looking long enough at people who'd been in Head Start who were high school age or college age, we found as kids who were in Head Start who are from at-risk populations or low-income families, they're more likely to graduate, less likely to be involved in drugs, less likely to be involved with public assistance in the criminal court system, and they're more likely to graduate from high school and an increased probability of graduating from college. So it's a huge, enormous success. In fact, if we're going to just value everything based on IQ score gains, then that's going to be somewhat problematic because that's a challenge in the first place. But eliminating Head Start's probably not a great idea. But Head Start serves 716,000 preschool children families. Eliminating Head Start would deny services to these individuals who desperately need it. Phasing out of Title I would harm low-income students and their families. Loss of Title I funding is estimated to reduce teacher workforce by 180,000 teachers. We already have a teacher shortage, not only teacher shortage, but we have school psychology shortage, not enough of individuals who are in speech and hearing, auditory processing, those fields, school nurses. I mean, we have issues, no doubt. But IDA provides $14.4 billion a year to states in formula-based grants. And that's important, that term, formula-based grants. Because formula-based means some states don't need they have fewer kids who have special education needs, so we're going to give it to the states that need it the most. And there'll be fewer states who don't need it getting that funding. So it assists states to implement special education related services, and states must provide FAPE, free appropriate public education to all children with this funding. Project 2025 suggests converting the formula-based grants to block grants with no strings attached, meaning that they're going to give the money back to the states, not formula-based, just give it back to the states with no strings attached, meaning they can use it for whatever purposes they want. So, here in Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, they might use it to build football stadiums with rather than helping kids with special education because there's no strings attached. Remember that the Department of Education was there to some extent to bring efficiency and to provide oversight that the states would actually use the funding to run special education, not other things. But also Congress, at the time, 1975 said, we'll give 40% of educating a child on top of what a child already gets with this formula-based grants so that you can fund special education. And then every year since, they've reneged. So instead of 40% funding, they're providing right now a little bit less than 13%. And so when you're asking yourselves, why do we have this schism between what's going on in schools and what parents' rights are and the rights of the child? Parents know that they have these rights and they should go to their school to get FAPE for their child. And schools are pushing back. Why are they pushing back? Because they don't have the funding to provide the services and they have a teacher shortage. So, I mean, I see both sides here, right? And the way to correct it is to fully fund the Department of Education and certainly to fully fund special education. And there's been bills to do that, but they've gotten nowhere in Congress, unfortunately. But that no accountability is not a good thing because there's a reason why that, there are 7 deadly sins and that one of them is greed. You get money and there's no string attached. Well, you can use it for whatever you want, not for its intended purpose. But with no strings attached, there's no intended purpose. Title I provides $18 billion a year to states with formula-based grants to support high poverty schools to help improve the academic achievement of low-income students. Because these low-income students, many of whom have the raw intellectual power and determination and will to do something and to make a contribution with their lives, but they need the help to do so. And in high poverty rates, because we can right now, we can look at schools, we can look at kids' zip codes to determine who's going to be struggling and not. And those zip codes are associated with low income. Again, that formula-based grant process with no strings attached, no accountability is not good. Not good at all. A little bit more about the voucher programs, because that's, obviously one of the goals. There really the research out there, and there's still ongoing research, but the educational gains using vouchers or ESAs not very strong, or in some cases negative. Some studies find substantial negative impact, and I provide the sources here for you to look at if you want to. Public schools may offer relatively better instruction for low-income students than private schools. And you have to remember that the same schools that are private schools are using and hiring teachers who have been educated in the same places that people in public education are. So to think that somehow paying more out of your own pocket for education is going to equate to better education is not necessarily the case. And I'm not talking about schools, say, that are devoted specifically for dyslexia, who have people who are trained to deal with people who have dyslexia and know structured literacy and those types of things. We're not talking about that, but just the general run-of-the-mill, hey, my kid goes to a private school, absolutely does not mean that child's getting a better education with regard to reading, particularly if they have a disability, where I personally think, too, that even if you're a private school, since public funding is provided for education, probably there should be some, special ed services for those kids, but that's not how it's working today. So in reality, you're taking a kid out of a place that's struggling to provide special ed services to a place that doesn't have to at all. So it's problematic. It's certainly problematic. But I think sometimes people think if they pay more for something, it tastes better or it's better. And it's like, not necessarily. And certainly is not the case here. And for those people who have actually spent any time at all reading Project 2025, it only has about a 12% approval rating, which means most people think it's terrible, that we shouldn't be doing Project 2025. But again, it is the playbook for what is happening in the United States government right now, and in particular in education. So we cannot ignore it and say, well, that's not really what's happening. It is happening. I've showed you the page numbers where that was their goal, and you can see it happening right now. So here are the issues. And really, Tom Morello was the first to say, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. What's happening right now in the Department of Education is terrible. If you believe in education, and if you desire to have kids who have disabilities to be educated to the fullest extent, then you're not going to be pleased with what you're going to hear next. So the first day, the Trump administration was saying, hey, we're going to deal with the Department of Education. So Executive Order 14242 March 20th, 2025. The order instructs the Education Secretary Linda McMahon, who has basically no experience with education other than a small stint as on a school board. But anyway, instructs her to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over to education to the states and local communities, which they already have. Okay, that's what I want to point out to you. They already have authority over education. They never didn't have that. The Department of Education at the federal level never did that. All right. The only thing they were able to do is to say, for the funding that you're receiving for special education, you have to use it in this way. And you have to show that every child is being given an appropriate education, regardless of what they look like. The civil rights part. All right. They're not meddling in education in terms of what's going on in your kid's school. They don't pick your curriculum. They don't hire your teachers. They don't do any of that stuff. So this notion of returning authority over to education of the states is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It's just buzzwords to get people really riled up, and it's just not true. While ensuring the effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits on which Americans rely. It's not going to happen without the Department of Education. Now, granted, I hope that states will rise up and say, okay, we're going to take these block grants and we're going to do our due diligence to do the right thing. But it takes you to make sure that happens. You got to make sure that happens. You can't say, well, we're going to let the state legislators figure this stuff out and the Department of Education, your state figured out. No, you got to stand up and make sure that it happens. Because if you don't, there's going to be problems. And it's going to take, if we change this, it's going to take decades to fix. And we don't want that. We want this thing to work now. So right now, there is a House bill, H.R. 2691, sponsored by Moore of Alabama, McGuire and Gill of Texas, to abolish the Department of Ed, introduced April 7, 2025. There are two sections to it. Section 1 says abolish the Department of Ed, and each applicable program is terminated. What that means is every program administered by the Department of Ed goes away, except for the federal Pell Grant and Ford Direct Loan Program, and these will be transferred to the Secretary of the Treasury. Again, the Secretary of the Treasury Department hasn't been doing this. So do I believe they could get up to speed? Certainly. Is there going to be a time period where there's going to be nothing probably but chaos? Probably. Hopefully this doesn't happen, but it's been introduced. The second part of the bill refers to block grants to the states. And so in Section 2B, Elementary and Secondary Education Act grant program will be carried out by the Secretary of Education. And allocations will be based upon the proportion of federal tax that each state pays relative to the aggregate amount paid by all states. So what that means is they figure out how much Kansas pays in, what percentage of federal taxes Kansas pays in, and they'll get that money back percentage-wise from ESA for the block grants. So let's see how that plays out. Because what I did is I took the formula and figured these things out. And we originally presented this presentation in Georgia. So I used Georgia as the first example. Georgia receives 3.3% of the total ESA funds, $613 million for fiscal year 2025. Georgia paid in 2.84% of the federal taxes. So under H.R. 2691, Georgia will receive $527.5 million, which is $850 million less than they would have received otherwise. Which I'm thinking people in Georgia are like, that doesn't seem like a good idea for my kid that's in special ed. And so I thought, well, it might be interesting to see what's going to happen to the people who are sponsoring those bills. Remember, Moore in Alabama, McGuire and Gill in Texas. And you can see Moore in Alabama, they'll be receiving $165 million less in ESA funds. And Texas will be, given $300 million less. And I don't think Texans are going to be too happy about that. And then California, which has the fourth largest economy in the world, not just the United States. It's the biggest in the United States in the world, including entire countries, right? They'll be getting $655 million more dollars a year because they pay an enormous amount of federal tax. Do they need that? Well, I don't think anyone's going to turn the money down. And of course, they could always do better. But in reality, I don't really think this is, again, one of those kind of unintended consequences of saying things without actually determining what's appropriate for kids. Because that's what we care about. We care about what's appropriate for kids. So closing the Department of Ed would require Congress. It's going to require a supermajority in the Senate, which is 60 out of 100 senators. So it's really unlikely when we wrote this. It's more unlikely now because the redistricting plans that are occurring in red states, some of the Republicans in those states are saying, you know what, this isn't right, and we're not going to do it. And there's so the supermajority in terms of the Senate who are willing to vote for things that now they're feeling like, you know, this is just morally bankrupt. We shouldn't be doing these things is even less. And a simple majority in the House is that would require 218 to 435 votes. And in 2023, they voted and 335 people said, no, thank you. And 676 said, okay. So in reality, the Department of Ed is probably not officially going to be removed because it takes Congress to do so. But the problem is the money to drive it, the enforcement, because any law is only as good as its implementation. And so, like, if, you know, for me, I live in Pittsburg, Kansas. If I wanted to go to Kansas City, which is 120 miles north, and the speed limit is 75, and I'm like, well, I really need to get going. I need to get there quicker. So I drive 120 miles an hour to get there. And a state trooper pulls me over and says, well, sir, do you realize that you're driving 125 miles an hour and a 75-mile-an-hour zone? I'd say, yes, I know that. And he goes, okay, all right, well, you're on your way, because there's no implementing machinery to make sure that I have behaved myself appropriately, right? And so if we have the Department of Education, but we're gutting the Department of Education in terms of funding and services that are provided, then it essentially is the same thing. So again, we have to stand up as individual citizens, band together and say, we are not going to tolerate these things happening. So here are the scenarios, because I want you to know the positive pieces of it as well as what you can actually do. So if you have a child who is in special education right now or receiving a 504 plan, IDEA or ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, or the laws of the land. They're the laws of the land. They haven't been changed. They're not going to be overwritten. They're the laws of the land. However, administration of the laws has been affected and would continue to be dramatically affected by the reductions in the Department of Ed, personnel and funding, and people who are in universities who engage in probably somewhere between 80 and 95% of all research and development in the United States. Those grants have gone away. And so the research that's being needed to figure out what's appropriate for kids in schools and how to teach them is going away, that funding. So that part's not good, but we still have IDEA, ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act. So the Office of Civil Rights right now has been cut in half. We talked about this already. The backlog has increased by about 5,000 cases, a little bit more than that now, such that last week, the secretary said, hey, we need some of you guys to come back and handle some of these cases because we're not getting it done. Yeah, no kidding. So I think, to some extent, there's some realization that these are bad moves that have occurred and they're trying to rectify, but we can't rely on them because these are the people in the first place that thought it was a good idea to get rid of these programs. And so Marcy Lipset, who's a special education advocate, her response is, this is horrible. I'm watching children suffer like they've never suffered. There's no accountability. So the 90% of the cases right now are just being dismissed without investigation because they can't handle it. And the civil rights of students right now are not being upheld. And again, we're a nation of diversity, and civil rights are pivotally important in the United States. is I think if we ask the average person, like, what's the most important amendment do you think? Most people say the First Amendment. I think probably because the First Amendment's pretty important because it says that you can say things and not be imprisoned by the government. You can act as recourse and publicly ask for and demonstrate and do those kinds of things. We have the right to religion or the freedom to be from it. So the First Amendment really is really incredibly important amendment, as well as I think all the rest of them as well. But I think what people don't recognize, the Fifth Amendment, which is the due process of law, if you don't have the Fifth Amendment, you got no other amendments. They don't have any more of them. I mean, it's like if you can take people off the street without having habeas corpus, meaning we got evidence that you engaged in a crime, and take them away, we don't have the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment doesn't say this only applies for people who are citizens of the United States. It applies for every person inside the United States. So right now we're seeing that the Fifth Amendment's getting blown away. And people are saying you should carry around your papers even if you are a citizen. Like, what? That's craziness, right? So again, I don't want to, cause you any stress, but if you think that these things are not happening, they are happening. And it's important that we're aware that they're happening and we try to do something before it's too late. Because it may be too late, fairly soon for your child who's in special education. I don't have any kids in school. I have grandkids in school. They're not in special ed, but I still care about all kids, and all kids in special education need to have access to a free, appropriate public education. If we just sit around saying, well, whatever, it doesn't affect us, it will affect you because the inability to read affects everyone. It costs the U.S. economy $2.2 trillion a year. It affects our national defense. It affects our well-being, our psychological, emotional status. It is critically important to our nation in general. So it's important for us to do something about this. It's not too late right now, but if we keep waiting and waiting and waiting, it will be. Although I'm seeing some progress in Congress right now. People are saying, you know what? I really don't think what's happening is good. And even though I've been bullied and, people say they're going to make sure I don't get voted back in office, I got to do the right thing for me morally and ethically. So I'm thinking that may be a good sign for us, but it's still important for us as grandparents and as parents and as educators and just human beings in the United States to stand up and say, we demand more for our children than what y'all are planning right now. So the OCR right now is aligned with the administration's agenda, which is limiting the rights of transgender students, investigating schools with DEI programs, and a priority is no longer protecting the civil rights of our students, which is not who we are as a people. If you ask most people in the United States if they'd agree with these things, they would say, no, I do not agree with these things. Then my response is, then we better do something about it because it's happening right now. And the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights budget is planned to be reduced by another 35% next year. So the weakening of the Department of Education's ability to oversee what is happening at the state level to ensure that IDEA is being properly administered within schools is a problem. The Office of Management and Budget is the largest office in the executive branch, in the executive office of the president. Its key responsibility is to manage the president's budget. Russell Voigt is the director of OMB right now. He is one of the main architect of 2025 and actually wrote chapter 2. So again, if you think these things aren't happening, they're happening. And I don't think that most people agree with what's happening. So who's affected? Students with disabilities, the largest category of OCR complaints, victims of discrimination and harassment based on race, origin, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And you can see that's already being weakened. And vulnerable populations. That's what the Office of Civil Rights is supposed to be protecting. That's what they're not doing that right now. These things are not happening. What's happening is to make sure that DEI is out of our curricula, even though we are a nation of diversity and we want to be inclusive. and to ensure that transgender individuals aren't participating in sports, essentially. And so that, again, that's such an enormously small number of people. The Institute of Education Services, the budget is over 67% at this point. It's terminated $900 million in grants. The National Center of Education Statistics that does the NAEP reading is certainly one of those. Not sure how 2026 is even going to happen, but the argument is, yes, we're still going to do it. So, we'll see. The regional educational laboratories are being cut. Research, development, and dissemination is being cut. And statewide longitudinal data systems, which you might think really aren't that important. But see, the issue is today things are changing, such that like AI, what's going on with AI? How is AI going to affect education? How is AI going to affect people's abilities to get jobs? Because I think a lot of times people are blaming the government for things that are happening in the business world. For example, Georgia Pacific that has, does a lot of, lumber. They used to have hundreds of workers in one of their places where they cut their wood to 2x4s and 4x8s and whatever. But now they have very minimal staff. The people that bring the wood in, the person that controls the operations via computer, and the person that takes it out. So hundreds of jobs have been lost. Right now we have global warming issues, and the extent that humans are involved needs to be addressed. And so fossil fuels, and everywhere else but the United States, fossil fuels and oil and gas is being diminished, and such that companies that are paying people to go underground and dig up coal, there just aren't those jobs. There are some jobs, but they aren't really the same jobs as before. So again, we're losing the opportunity for people to have decent jobs. And what you see across the world is essentially three things. One, generally people tell you they want to make enough money to survive in the world and to have a family and not have to worry about their family. Two, they want to make a contribution in some manner to their society. And for me, I think any work is good work. If you're a teacher, that's good work. If you're a scientist, it's a good work. If you're a person who's collecting the trash from our houses, that's good work. If you're, welding I-beams to build buildings, that's good work. All work is good work. And then the third thing is to have people leave you alone. And see, we're already eroding number one, because number one, we're not teaching kids how to read well enough to get the kind of jobs that are out there that pay well. Number two, robotics is taking over and has been for decades. Is there a repetition kind of movement, repetitive movement? Businesses are building robotics to deal with that repetitive movement. Why pay someone $50,000, $60,000 a year when you can build a robot and not pay anybody, right? So some of these issues is the changing world around us, and we need to be aware of that. And that's what these longitudinal studies, these statewide longitudinal data systems and longitudinal studies do, is they examine out into the future, what are the types of jobs we need to be training people for. And when we don't support those, because we dropped that $900 million in funding to do that type of work, we're not going to be prepared for it. We're going to have more people who are unhappy. And that's not who we are. We should be the land of opportunity, but the land of opportunity begins with education. So the Institute of Educational Sciences, these are these kinds of programs we're talking about. The Institute of Education Sciences also studies and examines educational strategies. They stop inappropriate strategies before they're implemented, like the 3-queuing system. Of course, unfortunately, that wasn't stopped when it should have been in the 1970s. So now we have a reading crisis in the United States and other places because we really didn't stop strategies that shouldn't have been implemented in the first place, because it is not what you need to do to teach kids how to read. You absolutely have to teach them that it's a code. So just as an example, the inefficiency because of the budget rescission and people leaving and being cut from their programs is every year by June 1st, Congress requires a report from education that tells about what's going on in our country with regard to education. And that deadline was already missed. And what they did provide was way less than they ever provided before. So there's less data that's being provided. It won't give you a whole lot of that specific information, but that reduction in force, eliminating positions is not helping at all. But some of these things are being blocked by the judiciary, but they're also being ignored by the executive branch, which is one of the first time in history, although Andrew Jackson back in the day did some of that himself, and so did Andrew Johnson. But generally, we have three branches of government that are separate but equal. And so we need to listen to the judiciary when they're interpreting the laws that Congress has made and that are being carried out by the executive. And that's, again, something that's not really happening right now. So when you get to dispute resolution with an IEP, you still have the same recourse that you did before: negotiation, mediation, not medication. Although you might feel like you need one after going to your first IEP meeting. That's mediation, resolution, meeting, due process, state complaint, and litigation. OCR complaints no longer a viable strategy. That's not happening. No one's paying any attention to that. You're not going to get much care for that. But in reality, the best way to deal with dispute resolution and IDEA anyway is to figure out a way to help people get on the same page, or to at least contact your state agency. Parents generally have much better success contacting their state than going to due process and litigation. Litigation is time consuming. It's hard on your nerves on both sides. You waste a lot of time doing things, and generally parents lose. So state complaints are much better because states are generally a little bit more able to provide some recourse that's appropriate. So anyway, again, I can send some of these things to you, and in the end, there's a link where you can actually see the booklet. I kind of want to get on to some of the other aspects of what you can do, because I wanted you to see the history and why we're in where we are right now, because that's important. Because why would we get up and say anything if we don't think there's a problem? There's a problem. There definitely is a problem. But I would like to give a shout out to SpedX Consulting, which is a Massachusetts program. They're very small, but they provide the types of mediation kinds of things, resolution services, and they've lowered their due process complaint process. But again, they're still small. I think every state and every parent should have access to those kinds of things. So what can you do? I think this is the important part, because it helps us to know what we can do to help our kids, which is essentially, what we're here to discuss. So we know there's an issue, no doubt. So what you can do, we have special education related services because parents stood up in the first place. If we look at the Education for All Act, which is a House Bill 90 from Washington State, 1971, it was the precursor to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, but it's a grassroots effort led by these parents: Janet Taggart, Cecile Lindquist, Katie Dolan, Evelyn Chapman. They made these things happen, and they stood up and said, hey, we've got kids who have disabilities, but they also need to be educated. They can learn. They have the ability to learn. And that led to, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of legislation that was a bipartisan solution to a problem that was definitely there. As Donna said, she graduated in 1976. I don't know what that was from, high school or college. I'm guessing high school. I graduated in 1977 from high school, and that was 2 years after the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So when I went to grade school, we didn't have kids with disabilities in our schools. We did have, in high school, we had a kid with a disability. But now today, we have kids who with Down syndrome who are the homecoming kings and queens. Why? EHA, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. We found out that, wow, Down syndrome people are really cool. They're awesome people. And that's one of the things that we should learn from IDEA is people with disabilities are human beings who deserve our respect, who make contributions to society, and they can be our friends. Then we have Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Mills versus DC Board of Education, a lot of legislation that has occurred during this time period. And it's okay. And then, of course, decoding dyslexia in 2011, just a few parents in New Jersey. And when I found out about them in 2013, they were in 47 states and 2 provinces in Canada. Now they're in 50 states and 4 provinces in Canada because parents stood up and said, I'm sick and tired of schools saying we don't know nothing about dyslexia and we don't need to. Yes, you do. Because in 2011 was several years after 2004 that specifically stated in IDEA dyslexia, right?
Right.
So they stood up and said, we need to do something about this and let's make it happen. So it led to state laws for dyslexia. 47 states have dyslexia laws in one shape or form. Generally, it starts off with early identification and then with intervention. And some states have been able to get colleges of education to adopt structured literacy and to dive into the science of reading rather than just do what your forebears did. So these are important things that happen because of parents. So what can we do? We got to spread the word. Like, the science of reading, what I should have learned in college has 143,000 people who follow that page. There should be
243.
443.
240.
Two. Okay. Thank you, Donna. That's a lot of people.
It is.
That's a lot of people, right? And they should be spreading the word about this to spread the word to others so we can stand up united to stop these things from happening. So spread the word, contact your state legislators, convince Congress to support children. And I think right now they're becoming more likely to listen to these things because I think they're thinking these things are not morally or ethically appropriate. We got to join together like Decoding Dyslexia, learn more about legislation, be active. We all have to participate. And don't think you don't matter. You do matter. I mean, you absolutely matter. I mean, these moms mattered. And then we have a national law, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So, these are questions to start conversations with your legislature. So I've written some down to get things started off for you. And in a couple of minutes, I'll give you the QR code so you can see who your senators are and your representatives are in Congress if you don't already know them, and how to access your local state level senators and representatives. So ask your legislator, governor, how will fate be guaranteed if we have block grants that go to states? And now you know that the notion is for the block grants to come back with no strings attached. So they say, oh, we got that covered. You see, how is that going to be covered? How is that going to work? How are we going to make sure that our children with disabilities will be given a free, appropriate public education? How will IDEA and Section 504 be enforced? How will IDEA Section 504 be administered? How will my child with a disability not be harmed if we don't have these things to support them? If states were not individually capable of providing FAPE before, then how are they going to do it now, right? These are questions that need to be asked. If no strings blocks attached are provided to states, here are some questions to ask legislators and governors. Will you guarantee that those funds will be spent solely on special education related services and not on non-IDEA services like new sports complex or regular education or band uniforms or building upkeep, which are all super important. Not saying they're not. But those monies are supposed to be spent on special education related services. So with no strings attached, how are you as a legislator, as a government official, going to make sure that happens? And that might start actually at your state Department of Education, because they should be concerned and probably are very concerned that these things may be harder for them to accomplish. So how can we help you to talk to legislators and to senators? if no strings block grants are provided to states, just regard to like ESA funds, or IDA, will special education related services be fully funded from that state? How? They're not now. So how's that going to happen? Congress provided or promised that additional 40%, and that's not happening. So how are states going to do better? I would argue they're not, but and I say probably some states will be doing pretty good. The states that probably already are doing well, right? But the states who are doing poorly now just don't see it happening. Not without us standing up. So how will our state spend the funds for Title I schools? How will low-income students who are vulnerable students, who we care about because they're human beings in our state, who are vulnerable to not only chronic stress and food and housing insecurity, and that's a real thing too, among other challenges, how are we going to help them? How are we going to make sure that they come to school and they're provided a meal so that they have the opportunity to learn?
Mm-hmm.
How will you ensure that these students get the resource they need for their life, their liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How's that going to happen? Because that's who we are as a people. And we didn't say, we didn't really say that it's only for rich people. It said it's for all people, right? Of course, if we want to really get in the nitty gritty of that, the framers of the Constitution were very rich, land-owning white people, or white males, right? So, but those things have changed. We just don't want them to go back, right? And so states rely on the scientific work that is accomplished by the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. Ask your legislators, public schools rely on that work. How are we going to know how to best educate our students? Are you going to provide additional funding to our institutions of higher education and now do this work that the national level is not going to do? Or how are we going to work to fully staff the IES? Colleges of education rely on the work that is accomplished at IES so that they're able to appropriately train the next generation of teachers. How are we going to make that happen now? Do you know that the National Center for Education Statistics is part of the IES? Because they probably don't. The National Assessment of Educational Progress and Reading is administered by NCES, which helps us to know if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing to teach our kids to read. And of course, not really good right now. Even with structural literacy practices being implemented now in many school systems, it's going to take a while to get this thing on board. Because what teachers are saying, yeah, we're doing letters and we're doing other things, but still we need help. How does this work, right? So it's going to take a while. So one of the things we don't want to have happen is people to say, look, things still are really terrible, so structural literacy isn't very good, so let's just go back to the way we had it because, hey, we're cool with that. And actually, we can train middle schoolers to teach 3 queuing system. Super easy. You don't get that word? Hey, look at the picture. Does that help you? This story's about what? What's that picture? Elephant? Oh, maybe the word's elephant, right? Or what were we talking about in the first sentences before? Guess that, right? We don't want to go to that because the English writing system is built on a code. You have to know the code to read, to write, and spell. So we don't want to go back. So we need the help because what's going to happen, my fear what's going to happen is we're not going to see progress and people are going to say, well, we can just go back to having kids guess at words again. That's cool. That was just as good because we didn't implement structural literacy properly, right? But this is more than just structured literacy and dyslexia. It's all kids with disabilities. It just happens to be that most kids who are receiving services are kids who are struggling readers. And the kids who are receiving services for other reasons are also struggling readers, right? So, this is important. Now that the Office of Special Education and Civil Rights are being eliminated, how will FAPE be guaranteed? How will IDA in Section 504 be enforced? How will IDA Section 4 be administered? Remind your legislator that it is not lawful for the executive branch to unilaterally withhold funds appropriated by Congress. If Congress is the purse keeper, as they've always said, right? And so if Congress has appropriated monies for a certain thing to happen, the executive branch can't come in and say, no, you don't get to use that money for that, which is happening right now. So we have to stop that from happening. We have to stop it from continuing to occur. We have to help the people who are in Congress understand we're watching you. We care about what you and we care about what you're doing. We care about our kids. We're watching you. We're the ones who vote for you.
Mm.
And so here's how to contact your legislators. If you use that QR code, you can see who your U.S. senators are if you don't know them. You probably do know your U.S. senators, but there's many more U.S. representatives, so you can use that link to find that. And your state legislators, this takes you to a site that'll ask you for your state and then what you want to know, and that'll be provided. And we have a QR code at the end that has all these QR codes. So you can use the QR code right now to see where you need to go and write that down or save it. Or you can wait and download our booklet that we're continuing to update as we go because there are changes. Some of the changes actually are, not necessarily good, but make me feel better that we can do something. Because in reality, we send people to Congress to solve the problems that we as a people are unable to solve by ourselves. That's what we send people to Congress to do. Now, unfortunately, because of the 1980s and 1990s were so ugly, we eliminated many of the moderates who were interested in solving a problem. And now we find ourselves with individuals who are there to enrich themselves or to gain power. Those are not the reasons why we send people to Congress. In fact, maybe the Greeks had it right. Everyone takes a turn being in Congress. But that would mean that you'd spend 2 or 4 years in Congress, which is something you probably don't want to do. So we're okay with sending people to Congress, but we want them to honor their role to find solutions to the problems that we as a people face. Because my view of government is it's for the people, of the people, by the people. And we can do much more in group form than we can individually. For example, if you say, well, I think we should only collect taxes for police officers to have police and for military, then don't drive your car on the roads that you didn't help pay for, right? So, I mean, we're here because we can do more together than we can individually. And to solve this problem is going to take more collectively than we can do individually. So I'm hoping that maybe this will help you to see what the issues are and that you still have the power to make a difference. Because never doubt that you cannot make a difference. It's really the only thing that ever has. That we say, here's a problem, I'd like to help fix it. Let me find some like-minded people to help me fix it. And let's then ask people to help solve the problem that we can't help solve. So I certainly believe in this notion that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. That's what we do. That's how we got special education in the first place. So let's fight to keep it. So
Excellent.
what questions do you have? I'm going to show you this.
David, we have one question from
Yes.
Louisa. Louise, sorry. Louise, do you want to ask the question or should I read it for you? I think she's still on. I'm going to read it. Can you speak to this upcoming federal tax credit from the OBBBA for contributions to SGOs? What will be the impact? How best to respond? My organization is writing to request that funds be used for public schools, not just charters and private schools. What else?
Well, yeah, Louise.
Let me see.
Hi, sorry, I had to step away, but thank you. Um, I'm back. I'm just curious what I'm trying to catch up on whatever this credit is and what its impact is going to be. And there's an open public comment period until December 26th. So there's only about 57, 58 comments on the Treasury website so far.
Um, well, on the one hand, I think that anyone that gives money to help people who are low income, like the Dells, what they just did, is probably, a good thing because we need more people who are benefiting from our form of economy to help put something back. Um, that's again kind of who we are as a people is like, I've been successful, so I want to help other people become successful. It shouldn't be just about, I'm the richest person in the world. Because, a couple of years ago, my wife asked me, she said, when are these people rich enough? When is that? What's that? And I said, when they have it all. I mean, that's the answer, right?
But
So
isn't the
yeah,
money being essentially the intent is to funnel it to private, charters, private schools where, rich people that's where they, their children are in those schools and most struggling students are in public schools, who
yes,
need and so
right.
it's a lot of potentially billions of dollars that's going to go to charter and public. And like you said earlier, it doesn't necessarily mean the instruction's any different. The training of those teachers in their education preparation programs is the same as those who are in teaching in public schools.
Yeah, so I guess part of it for me, it makes me a little sad. Because again, really a lot of this stuff goes back to our failure to address Reconstruction. And maybe even if we addressed Reconstruction properly, we'd still have people that said, hey, I'm better than you. I have more money. I want my kids to have everything and I don't really care about you guys. We'll probably have a little bit of that anyway. But it's that kind of rise of the, white patriarchal supremacy that is driving a lot of these things. And as and I guess we have to decide as a society, what are the things that we really believe in? Do we believe in the opportunity for everyone, or do we believe in the opportunity only for people just like me? And if it's just like me, then I'm not signing up for that. In reality, if you keep funneling and essentially putting up barriers so that not everyone gets these opportunities, then we say later on, look, see, they didn't do as well. Like, no kidding, they didn't do as well. We never gave them the opportunities. They don't even from birth have opportunities to visit places that increase their intellectual functioning or their vocabulary or those types of things. We never provided them with great schools with teachers who are highly motivated because they live in a terrible place, right? So we already have enough barriers put up. But if we're going to continue to drive lots and lots of money to places to people who don't need that money, it's mind-boggling to me. It's just, like I said, I'm a product of the 60s and 70s. So for me to be, you know, one of those individuals that like, I'm going to take all my money and I don't care about anybody else. I just don't think that's who we really are as a society. It's like if you look at Jeff Daniels, he was in a show in the early 2000s. I think it was called Network or something like that. And he's on stage with two other people. And, a person from the audience says, what makes the United States the greatest country in the world? And the other two people say something like freedom and opportunity. And so they ask him, and he's like, yeah, what they said, freedom and opportunity. And then, he says, no, I really want a response from you. And he says, we're not the greatest country in the world. We're not. We could be, but we're not any longer. We're 26th in education. We're 35th in this. The only thing that we're high on is the number of people we put to death and incarcerate and the amount of money that we spend on the military, which is more than the next 12 or 13 countries combined who are our allies, right? So, the notion of, if we took some of this money, or even if you want to get crazy and actually had a taxing program that would actually allow people to pay whatever their fair share is, we would solve most of the problems we have. Most of the problems we have today are solvable problems. Pick a problem, it's solvable.
Yeah,
So
this particular tax credit, though, seems to be aimed specifically at weakening. I mean, it will have the effect of severely weakening the public school system, which hurts everybody instead of strengthening it. But ultimately, whether the money goes here or there, anywhere, you probably agree until we do something, as Doug Carnine says, to bring the education system into, an evidence-based profession, we're not going to get anywhere with, standard accreditation and licensure and some kind of oversight. So any case, but this credit is a worry. It should be an alarm system going off for people who care about public education.
I would agree with you, and I'd say maybe we should include this as part of the things we ask our state legislators about
Mhm.
what's going to happen, how this is going to work. And I agree with you, and I certainly agree with Doug that, for my personal opinion, that anyone else can disclaim and say, no, I disagree with you. But, I think education from individuals who are receiving training as paraprofessionals, people who are being trained as bachelor's level, master's level, EDS, and doctoral level, they have to know about science. They have to be able to be competent to read the science, to perform science, but at least consume it so that we don't make the mistakes of this psycholinguistic guessing game that popped its head up. It had its roots from a couple of hundred years ago. We need to be able to say, hey, that's not right. That's not what the science says. You know, even in the 1970s, Stanovich and West took a look at that and went, that makes sense. Let's take a look. And he went, nope, these are what kids do who can't do decoding. They are trying to do compensatory mechanism by trying to figure out what they can do to figure out how to read because they can't decode, right?
Mhm.
So yes, we need to get back to evidence-based, no doubt. I completely agree with that notion. And in my opinion, I think most people share this opinion who are scientists that when we stepped away from science informing our instruction and how we should train individuals to be educators, that's when we started the problem. And yeah, anytime that we're giving a privileged group of people more money to do more with it rather than helping everyone, I think that's a problem. And it's not a socialistic necessarily view, although also if you look at the definition of socialism, that's a lot of what we've done always in the United States anywhere to help everyone have opportunities, right? And
Yeah.
when we don't do that, we become weaker. And eventually what happens when we keep giving the have-nots less, our history of human beings shows us that revolt and they will take all your money and everything you got from away from you and will redisperse it in a way that's more equitable.
Thank you. Well, we have about 9 days to respond, and then the Treasury is going to write the regulations for this. So it's coming, and it's really very sad.
Yeah, I really didn't address that because it's kind of a new thing, and this was kind of based on our presentation before it came out. But you're
Yeah.
100% correct. This probably should be something we add to this and say, yeah, let's, you know, I think most people say, well, whatever rich people want to do with their money is okay with me. It's like, but it in the end, it's going to mean that more kids are going to have the opportunity to not do public ed. In the end, public ed will be composed of basically people who need IDEA or who are too poor to go anywhere else. And that's not public education.
No.
Yeah.
All right, we have one more question. If my legislators oppose what abolishing the education department, do these questions still apply?
I think what they're saying is that if they agree we should not get rid of the Department of Ed,
Mm-hmm.
then I'd say we better see you voting that way. you know, let's
Right.
strengthen what's going on in the Department of Ed. Let's make some noise. Let's get. I mean, part of what Congress should be doing is not just voting. They should be caucusing and talking to other people and saying, hey, this is a way that we can solve this particular issue. Let's join forces. It shouldn't really be about tribalism. We're a Republican, so we're not going to vote for anything you say as a Democrat, or a Democrat, we're not going to vote for anything that you say as a Republican. They got to be voting on things that are good for their constituents, even if their constituents don't know it's good for them, because that's one of our problems in the United States. Like, we a lot of times compare ourselves to Finland and say, oh, Finland's doing such a great job in education. Let's emulate them. We can't. They're a small country. They're all white people. They're homogenous. When they vote for a piece of legislation, they're voting for themselves, their family, for their neighbor, for their countrymen who are all the same color and the same people basically as them. In the United States, we have people who vote against things that are good for them because they don't want their lazy neighbor down the street to get something that would be good for them, even though their lazy neighbor is working 2 or 3 part-time jobs and they don't have access to health care or I mean, so we need to be more educated and we need to kind of help spread the word because most people, if we looked at, our normal distribution, most people are right here. No matter what they call themselves, they want to do the best they can for their kids. They want their kids to be educated. They want their kids in their neighborhood to be educated no matter what color they are. Most of us believe the same thing. You take any, gun legislation, 60, 80% of people say something should happen. Global climate change, 70% of people say something should happen. Most of us believe in the same kinds of things, which means we believe in each other. And we still do believe in each other, but we let people who don't necessarily care about us control what happens to us. And we need to take it back.
Yeah.
And like Louise says, we need to do something about, undercutting our public education because I see international students and they come to the United States because number one, we have some of the best higher education in the world. We have opportunities for people. People who are teaching them in higher education aren't going, well, you're from India, we don't care about you. You're from Pakistan, we don't care. We care about you because you're my student, right? So we still are the land of opportunity, but we're just not capitalizing on it. And the way to capitalize on it is make sure everyone gets a decent education. Without it, we're doomed. We just are doomed. But we have the power to come back and do something about that. So anyway, on this page here, this is the link to our little booklet that we have that has all this stuff in it. And I'm going to add Louise's ideas in there because that's something we need to pay attention to. And thank you for bringing that up because I've been reading about it, but it really wasn't on my radar. But you're 100% correct. And I very much appreciate you mentioning that. Here's some books that you can look at. And we have our children's books there. There's 2 versions of 2 volumes of our, dyslexia books that talk specifically about the history of special education and what you can do to make sure that your kid gets a proper IEP or 504 plan, stuff like that. We wrote it for parents so they become more informed. And if you have questions, for me, I love getting questions. And for Thomas, he also as well.
Someone said
And
the red QR code is not working.
oh my gosh, and I paid extra for that. Those, I think the one that I sent you, well, there's not a lot of people here, so
Right.
do you have the ability for me to just send you the
Send
link?
it to me and I'll put everything in the YouTube video and Google it, a Google link or something, and we'll figure it out. It'll get to
Okay.
people.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's do something, guys. You got anything else to add, Thomas? I'm the mouthy one in the family.
No, you got it. You covered it.
I want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here tonight, with your expertise and your passion, actually. And I hope you're right. I hope we can turn this ship around. I don't know. It's going to take a lot of work, but
we can do it.
but we can do it. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you again, David and Thomas. I really, really appreciate your talents.
And thanks for asking. We appreciate it. And
You're
thanks,
welcome.
Louise, for your ideas. Seriously, I appreciate them.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, definitely share the links that I have an email that I can send. Oh, Donna, you got the email from my
Yes.
colleague Katie Scullion. So if anyone just wants an easy way to respond to Treasury, they can sign as an individual or organization to there's a form to fill out. There's the memo and then there's the form. The email is the link to both. But either way, yeah, I mean, there's 9 days and then I think the Treasury regs will get written. And it's I think, a disaster.
You know what, Louise, why don't you post it on the big page? Can you do
Okay.
that for me?
Yeah, I'll forward it from our Illinois Early Literacy
Sounds
Coalition
great.
page.
Yeah, and then give a little explanation of what it is, and hopefully
Thank
we'll
you.
reach some people. You bet.
Yep, will do.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.